For example, he says, let me give you an example. He says, sometimes we want there to be more poverty because that will lead to more worker misery, which leads to more revolution. And so one gets a vicious circle. Strikes, more hunger, more inflation, more hunger. He says that there's a response from Gabriel. He says, well, with the exception of the strikes, this all takes place at the expense of the surplus value out of capitalism. Rakowski says, you are speaking theory, pure theory. Between you and I, take any handbook concerning the economics of any country, and if you divide the rents and the total income by those receiving wages and salaries, you will see that an extraordinary result emerges. The result is that the most counter-revolutionary fact, and we must keep this a complete secret, he says, is that the abolition of ownership almost always then remains with a dividend, which is a debit for the proletariat. In other words, the revolution always ends up costing the workers. In reality, a debt, if we consider the reduction in the volume of quantity of production, is a debt that is foisted upon the workers. And so he says the more strikes, the more destruction, the more chaos. It doesn't hurt the capitalist elite, it hurts the workers. And he says that we're absolutely fine with that because that's the secret to how the revolution continues. More and more misery. And this is blowing the mind of Gabriel. He's like, this doesn't make any sense. I can't understand this. And he says, that's because you don't understand what Marxism is. He says, you think that Marxism is a economic system or a science or this or that. He says, no, it is a conspiracy first and foremost. And it is a religion of revolution. And Gabriel can't fathom that. He says, allow me to explain even further. Why do you think, he says, Marx concealed all the financial contradictions that I just mentioned, which could not have remained hidden from his penetrating gaze? If finance had not had an ally, the influence of which was revolutionary. In other words, do you think that Marx didn't realize that financiers and Western monopoly capitalists are already revolutionary? Don't you realize that capitalism is a revolutionary force? Anarcho-capitalism is the cousin out of the Enlightenment of its kissing cousin of the socialist, communist, Jacobin revolutionaries. And Gabriel says, well, this might be the case, but this is not intentional. It's an unconscious coincidence. He says, okay, well then we don't have to debate that. He says, let's look at another thing that makes this even clearer. Let's look at finance and what sort of people are at work. The international essence of money is well known. From the fact that the energies that organize them from a cosmopolitan organization. He says finance is inherently cosmopolitan. Finance in its apogee and its aim, and particularly the financial international, deny and reject anything national. In fact, they do not recognize the state. Therefore, capital is inherently anarchic and would be absolutely anarchical if the denier of any nation state were not itself by necessity a state by its own essence. The state as such is power. Money is also power. The communist superstate, which we are creating during this entire century, and the scheme of which is the International of Marx, analyze it and you will see its essence. The scheme of the International and its prototype, the USSR, is pure power. The basic similarity between the two creations is absolute, something fatalistic and inevitable, since the personalities and authors of both are identical. The financier is just as international as the communists. Both, with the help of differing pretexts and differing means, struggles with the bourgeois state or the national state and denies it. Marxism, in order to change it into a communist state, and from this, the Marxist must be an internationalist. The financier denies it, denies the bourgeoisie national state, and its denial ends in itself. In fact, he does not manifest himself as an internationalist, but as a cosmopolitan anarchist. Thus, there is the similarity between the Communist International and Finance International. He says this is because the god of the new societies, he's saying post-revolutionary, post-enlightenment periods, is money. The money god is the new god. And why is the all-seeing eye on the dollar bill? Because it's the money god. He says, interestingly, the money power is more cruel than any of the kings in the past. Interesting. And Rakovsky says, what do you mean this mythical power? You're attributing religious mythology power to money. How is that? He says, because they have the privilege of coining the money. And that is exactly what Quigley says in the first 200 pages of Treasure Hill. And Gabriel says, well, this is a wild paradox. He's sort of mystified by this. He says this is risky, it's even poetic. Rakovsky says, well, it's brilliant, but it's not a paradox. You may think that. And he says, you may think that states still coin money on pieces of metal, and they put a royal bust or a national crest on it. So what? The great part of the money that circulates is money for big affairs and represents national wealth. Money, yes, money, is being issued by a few people, but it's not the people that you think. The titles, the figures, the checks, the promissory notes, the endorsements, the discount, the quotations, they flood like a waterfall. What are these in comparison to the metallic and the paper money? And then he goes on to say that in the face of the growing flood of the all-flooding financial money, he says ultimately money goes back to the banks that issued the money. And the banks that issue the money are not state banks, he's saying. He says that the money system that's out there in the public use is based on financial monies that are credit money. So it's not actual money, it's fake money. Fiat. He says these are figures, abstractions. They're based on credit, based on faith. Do you not understand? It is fraud, false money. Banks, stock exchanges, the whole world financial system is a giant machine for the purpose of bringing about unnatural scandals, according to Aristotle's expression, to force money to produce money, aka usury. So it's a giant debt-based usury fiat system. So he's giving him a lecture in the exact same thing that Quigley says in the first 200 pages here. And basically explaining the Federal Reserve System, right? And he says that it's all based on shams and interest, and then more and more shams and more money printing, and this is where we get inflation. And the money's all fake. And he says, bear in mind the system I'm describing is one of the most innocent among those used for the fabrication of money. Imagine, if you can, a small number of people having unlimited power over the possession of real wealth, and you'll see that they are the absolute dictators of the stock exchange. And they will also be the dictators of production and distribution and work and consumption. If you have enough imagination, then you can multiply this by the global factor, and you will see that it is anarchical. You will see its anarchic moral social influence. It is revolutionary. Do you not understand? In other words, the fiat money system itself is the revolutionary system.